Good morning, everyone. My name is Will Pomeranz. I'm Deputy Director here at the Kennan Institute. And on behalf of Jane Harmon, our CEO and Director and President, I would like to welcome you to today's event on Bridging the Gap in Cybersecurity Policy, Emerging International and Domestic Issues. The Wilson Center is the living memorial to our 28th president, and we pride ourselves in serving as a bridge between the world of academia and the world of policy. Today's event is a great example of how we can facilitate such dialogue and address one of the most important issues facing the U.S. today, namely cybersecurity. The topic, as I'm sure all of you are well aware, has dominated the headlines and is already emerging as one of the most important national and international security questions of the 21st century. We have a very exciting program today, so I want to proceed to the main event as soon as possible, but a few very important thank yous are necessary before we get started. First and foremost, I want to thank our partners at the Jackson School, and particularly Joyce Noonan, Rishad Kasaba, Sarah Curran, and Jessica Beyer, with whom we have collaborated with on several occasions now, and we're so pleased that we're able to work again with you. In addition, I want to thank Meg King, the director of the Digital Futures Project here at the Wilson Center, who has provided significant input on the organization of today's event. I also like to thank Paul Nichols and Microsoft for their input. We are very pleased today to have Congressman Norman Dix here, who has been a great supporter of the University of Washington, the Jackson Foundation, and the Wilson Center, so welcome to today's event. And finally, a major thank you to our other co-sponsors, the Carnegie Corporation of New York and the Henry M. Jackson Foundation of Seattle, Washington. And at this time, I'd like to invite Stephen Del Rosso to the podium from the Carnegie Corporation for a few welcoming remarks as well. Stephen.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Thank you. I'll be brief because we want to get to the substance of this meeting. I'm very happy to be here, not only because there's a blizzard back in New York, because as I was telling a colleague, I can't build any snowmen here today, but this is the second project event that I have attended. Last one was at UW. I'm very much looking forward to learning more today. I will be brief, but I wanted to explain how this project fits into Carnegie's larger efforts in this area. This project is part of a broader initiative on bridging the gap between the academic and policy realms. And of course, the founder of Carnegie, the great Andrew Carnegie, was very much impressed with the power of ideas to promote positive social change. Now, much of what we do at the Carnegie Corporation, which is the grant-making foundation, by the way, not to be confused with the Carnegie Endowment down the street, but much of what we do and other foundations, we claim to be already bridging the gap between the academy and the policy world. But this is a much more focused effort, and it's premised on the belief, as is our entire initiative, that good ideas, good policy is informed by good ideas, and good ideas are not formed in a vacuum. And given the dizzying array of challenges on the international agenda, security agenda, we look toward the academy as one of the primary generators of those ideas. Now, this current grant, of which this project today, this conference today is part of, was a winning proposal to a request for proposal to all the APSIA, Association of Professional Schools of International Affairs, the 22 American-based schools. 2 years ago, Jackson School won one of 5 awards in this area. And one might ask, the APSIA schools by definition are already bridging the gap, but in fact, as we discovered, they are not immune to some of the problems facing political science and other social sciences, in particular political science, international relations, where in some instances a method is privileged over substance and policy-relevant scholarship is undervalued, particularly in tenure, promotion, and hiring decisions. And we believe that academic rigor is not incompatible with relevance, and I would add a third R, and that would be readability, which we're also trying to advance. So finally, although the subject of today's event is cyber, The main criterion for the winning proposal submitted by the Jackson School was, in fact, not so much the substance, of course we're quite interested in that, but the mode of bridging this gap between the academy and the policy realm. We're looking for research projects that incorporate exchanges across international, disciplinary, and scholar practitioner divides, and provide opportunities for scholars to address policy audiences, and that's what we're looking forward to today. I would say that in the current political environment, let me close with this, I think this challenge of bridging the gap is never more important, but also perhaps never more challenging. So with that, let me pass the baton back to our hosts. Thank you.
Well, thank you all for coming. I'm Rishad Kasaba. I'm the director of Henry M. Jackson School of International Studies at the University of Washington. When we are in Washington State, we always refer to ourselves as the other Washington, and now I guess I'm here at the other Washington. So the school actually, its origins go back to 1909. We like to call ourselves as one of the oldest schools of international affairs. And for a very long time, the school grew on the basis of, it was firmly based on deep area studies. It was a strong emphasis on language and culture of different world regions. But starting in the late 1970s, we have built on this foundation and developed theme-based programs with policy relevance. And that's about the time when we also took the name Henry M. Jackson. This on the passing of our senator, who's known as Scoop to his friends. And when he was still senator and working, he was very much involved in the early stages of the school. And he paid a lot of emphasis on bridging this divide and making use of the academic knowledge and expertise that existed at the University of Washington. So we are at this very uniquely advantageous position now. We are able to build on our area knowledge and develop policy relevant research and papers. It is a journey that started a long time ago, and we have also now recently cooperating with Woodrow Wilson Institute. And this is, I think, fourth or fifth conference we're hosting together. And we value this cooperation because it allows us, our faculty and students, to bring their knowledge to DC and also to interact with policymakers and opinion makers in this city. More recently, we have benefited from the support of the Carnegie Corporation. We became part of this initiative, as Steve mentioned, bridging the gap between academia and the policy world. And this has allowed us to deepen our communication with the policy world in new ways. In particular, we have taken advantage of our unique location in Seattle, which of course is one of the truly global cities, not only in the country, but in the world today. We have intensified our collaboration with Seattle-based companies, NGOs, and foundations. So the global reach and the global interests of companies like Microsoft are very well known, and we are especially pleased with our cooperation with them, and I'm very pleased that Paul is with us today, and that's part of a many-sided cooperation we're having with them, with other companies. Cybersecurity is one of the areas where our activities under Bridging the Divide initiative has concentrated. And under this initiative, we'll see examples today. We have produced policy briefs and on topics such as implications of China's development of an undersea cable infrastructure, challenges of expanding e-commerce to India, and North Korea's cyber operations. Now, this is, I think it is a sign of our times that just as we were leaving Seattle yesterday, our website where some of these policy papers were posted were attempted to be hacked, But we were very successful in protecting that website. But this is something that shows us that we have to be ever vigilant in this area. So we have working groups that include public and private representatives, and most importantly, I think we are teaching classes, and we have started to train the next generation of cybersecurity experts. You will also see the work of some of our students today, and I'm especially proud of their activities. So we are really very pleased to be able to showcase some of the fruits of our activities here in DC. And we have with us colleagues from the Jackson School, some of our Seattle-based partners, and also our students. And I really want to thank you all for coming, and I'm looking forward to a very fruitful, exciting discussion today. Next, we will hear a word of welcome from Congressman Danny Hack, who represents Washington's 10th district, and he couldn't be here in person, but we have a video that he taped for us, and we will see him there.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to the University of Washington Conference on Bridging the Gap on Cybersecurity Policy. I want to start out by commending you for asking difficult questions and seeking to create a more informed dialogue in this very interesting space. This is something I do on a daily basis. I have the privilege to represent Joint Base Lewis McChord, and I'm also a member of the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence. In this increasingly connected world, the cyber domain presents some of the greatest opportunities humanity has seen in 100 years. The ability to share information at light speed, collaborate with others on the far side of the globe, and analyze massive amounts of data is changing the way we conduct business and build relationships, and unfortunately, think about security. Cyber is such a powerful force that the folks at the Pentagon consider it the third offset, a strategy and capability so powerful it virtually assures victory in a conflict, and yes, pun intended. But this power creates a danger. Misinformation in the form of propaganda, theft of identifying information, cryptocurrencies plunging in value, and physical manifestations of a cyber attack, say on a utility company or on a person through text message. The questions we now face do not fit neatly into our understanding of security. Cyber blends acts of vandalism and crime and espionage and, yes, even war. It equalizes major military powers with smaller countries, non-state actors, and frankly, even some individuals. Cyber response strategy requires new thinking on proportionality, civilian distinctions, and military necessity. And all of this is not to mention the ethical and privacy considerations of the sharing economy. Autonomous vehicles piloted by artificial intelligence and cloud computing. So I really wish I could be there with you to discuss issues such as these in a more in-depth fashion, maybe even come up with a few answers. I'm confident that this conference will be a success with members of Microsoft, the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory, U.S. Department of Commerce, the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, and of course our very own University of Washington Jackson School of International Studies. I look forward to hearing back on the amazing panel discussions you have planned today, especially on what I can do as a member of Congress to create a more secure, but yet still innovative climate. So good luck, and I hope to see some of you when I'm back home in the other and the better Washington. Thanks very much.
Thank you. I just want to also recognize Congressman Norm Dix, who represented the 10th District.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to the
Danny Hack,
University
and
of
I'm very
Washington
pleased that he's
Conference on
with us,
Bridging
and
the
he
Gap
will
on
be
Cybersecurity
following this
Policy.
conference. Thank you very much.
I want to start out by
And thank you again. And I think now we are Sarah.
Well, I'll be very brief. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for the welcoming remarks earlier. I just want to quickly, I'm Sarah Curran, a professor at the University of Washington, former chair of the International Studies Program and director of the Center for Global Studies. I am here to I'll be moderating our keynote discussion, and I'm very pleased to introduce to you Paul Nicholas, who is one of our important partners at the University of Washington as we develop a collaborative cybersecurity working group and program. Paul Nicholas has been at Microsoft for 11 years, and he heads up the Global Security Strategy and Diplomacy team within the Trustworthy Computing Group at Microsoft. This is the only group like it in the IT sector in this country, and particularly with an emphasis around diplomacy. Before coming to Microsoft, Paul Nicholas spent 8.5 years in Washington at the White House and in the Senate addressing cybersecurity issues. And I'm very pleased to say this is our 5th year partnering with the Microsoft Corporation, and we're really delighted to have Paul offer a keynote remarks. Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah. It really is exciting to be here at the it's really great to be here at the Wilson Center. I think the range of issues that the institution takes on is really spectacular, and the way that they're able to do it in a nonpartisan way, I think, is more important than ever. And as Sarah said, it's also great to be here with my colleagues from the University of Washington. Over the past years, when I've had my dark days in cyber, it's really been encouraging and exciting to see the thoughts and the perspectives of the generation of students coming through the Jackson School, and the fresh perspective that they bring to problems has really been exciting, so thank you for that. I wanted to talk about international cybersecurity norms today. The world is going through a phenomenal transformation process. Sometimes you'll hear the term digital transformation. Oops, thank you very much. But you know, that is just sort of a bumper sticker that I think sometimes tech and marketing people put on this change so people can understand what it means. To me, it really is about something much more profound. It's about the distribution of power and opportunities and ideas and capital further and faster than at any point in human history. And in a large part, this is being driven by internet connectivity and the surge in things like cloud computing and all of these new sort of very interactive technologies. It is creating things that we just can't even anticipate today. But at the same time that these new opportunities are being created, we also have what I would call a rise in insecurity around the world. And when I say insecurity, I don't necessarily mean like, oh, I have bad security. I mean, countries in the international system start to feel insecure that, wow, my neighbor just made a huge investment in cyber military operations. Do I need to do that? Why is my competitor over here investing in cyber? Do I need to do that? This country is passing a law. Should I have laws? And within countries, you're also sensing this sort of insecurity amongst regulated entities who are trying to figure out, wow, these are really important critical infrastructures. Do I have the right legal framework? Do I have the right control in this space? How are we trying to deal with this? What are the things that we need to do to promote security and stability in cyberspace? And ultimately, how are we going to start to build the right types of mechanisms for the future of diplomacy? And how are we going to start to differentiate defense from security? So I'm going to explore a few of these topics this morning, and then we'll get a chance to kind of have Q&A about them and how we start to think about growing the next generation of leaders in this space. It's funny, one of the things that I think is really happening is we're starting to experience new dimensions of cyber. If you look up here, you'll see in the sort of the gray area are things that if you followed cybersecurity, you're kind of used to. Ooh, people steal things through cyberspace. Oh, not a big surprise. Denial and disruption happens in cyberspace. There are other types of things that we're sort of used to. Cyber attacks, malware, okay. We've had a long sort of protracted experience in this space. But the two things that are kind of new on this chart are destruction and influence. And how do those fit in? Certainly we've had a lot of discussion about that over the past few months. But this concept of cyber influence and information warfare, these are not new concepts. They've been around for a long time. It's just now there's technologies that sort of make this so much faster and so much more precise that we have to think about them differently. At the same time, there's a really interesting thing that's happening, and I call it sort of internet blindness. You know, we're a little bit excited about technology on the West Coast, and whether it's in the Valley or up in Seattle, and we tend to look through the future and everything is perfect. That's just what technology does. But when you make changes in technology, big changes like we're going through now, I also think you have the emergence of new forms of systemic risk. A couple of months ago, it was a very rainy weekend in Seattle. We have those most of the year. And I started a process of looking up where was the academic literature on systemic cyber risk. Turns out there's not a whole lot. And I landed with this really interesting report from the IMF, and I apologize for the policy wonk slide here. But when I looked at their definition of systemic risk for financial institutions, if you struck the word financial and you inserted the word cyber, it started to actually feel like, wow, that's kind of an interesting way to start thinking about systemic cyber risk. And I would say in particular this part here, you know, these events can be sudden or unexpected, or the likelihood of their occurrence can build up through the absence of appropriate policy and management responses. Wow, that's talking to us in this room and people at the Jackson School. We have a lot of things to really start thinking about in this space to understand the context in which we're operating in. So governments around the world are doing that. Today, we have about 80 countries in the world that are passing laws related to cyberspace. Sometimes they're about cybercrime, sometimes they're cloud computing laws, sometimes they're laws authorizing certain members or entities in the government to use malware for law enforcement purposes. That's always an interesting thing from a tech company to see somebody going out on a limb like that. Or they are other types of critical infrastructure laws. I really think over the next 3 years, we're going to see a foundation of laws created globally that we just have never really thought about. And what do they mean in the long term? Sometimes laws are really important because they help you deal with things like hygiene and compliance. But there's also a danger that people think there's a false, I should say it this way, people think there's a false sense of security that comes from that. I'm compliant, therefore I'm secure. Maybe, maybe not. You can be compliant with all sorts of standards and still be insecure. And my lawyer friends at the company always get nervous when I say that. They're like, well, we have all these compliance certificates. Yeah, absolutely. But threats outpace certifications. Threats are very dynamic. And you have to get used to that. And you need something that goes, you have to have standards and you have to have certifications, but you have to have an active ability that goes beyond that to anticipate threats and move forward. And the question is, how do we ultimately start to build the types of laws that are going to enable the sort of flow of data and innovation that we need to drive a global economy, and at the same time, construct technology that's going to respect national sovereignty? These are hard problems that we don't have answers to today, and I think there are a lot of dialogues going on around the country. It's part of the reason Microsoft created the team that I lead today, was to really help us have a different type of engagement with governments and policymakers and think tanks to try to think about what these solutions might be. So on one hand, we have governments passing laws, and then we have a strange thing that's happening. And this is one that has become increasingly unnerving to me in the world that I live in, and that's government investments in offense. That's a really interesting space. Today there's about 20 countries or so that have publicly declared that they have offensive capabilities. And there are certainly others who are building capabilities. But it's really interesting. Some of them are the countries you would expect, the large countries, US, Russia, China, North Korea, Iran. You can find all of those in The Economist and other places. Interesting. But Finland, Denmark, Zimbabwe was a recent one, who have decided they need offensive capabilities for certain things. Interesting. I always like to ask people where they think offensive weapons come from. Well, strangely enough, they tend to happen by exploitation of private sector commercial products. You know, in a traditional military situation, a government, if it needs a weapon or some sort of force projection, they go out and they design it and they build it and they develop it and they maintain it. In this space, a really strange thing has started to happen. Governments move into markets that used to be just criminal markets or academic security researcher markets, and they buy vulnerabilities. According to The Economist, some of those can range from $20,000 to $250,000 for a vulnerability. And then they build an exploit that takes advantage of that. That's really something to think about when you start to imagine the billions of dollars that are starting to be spent by militaries around the world strictly for exploitation. And I put it this way. I was recently reading Dead Hand, which is a great book on sort of the end of the Cold War. And there's a section in it that describes the Russian bio programs and how the Russians were looking to create incurable diseases. You know, if you start to create weapons, you want to win. And so you want a weapon that can't be defeated. Well, the problem is with cyber is weapons proliferate. Code gets reused. Weapons get reused. How are we going to fix that? Because oftentimes you find that while there's a lot of talk about investment in offense, there's not a lot of investment in defense. And there was some great testimony that the DNI gave, I think it was last year. It made a very sort of chilling comment that $1 of offense buys you a lot more capability than $1 of defense. And we have got to turn that around as a community and start to think about this differently. And I would argue that we should start first with a discussion of norms. What are the things that we can start to promote like-minded countries to think about in terms of managing cyberspace more effectively? What are the things that we can do from a government perspective? And also, what are the things that technology providers like Microsoft also need to think about that they should be doing in this space? And I'm going to share 6 of those with you now, just as a starting point. These are not perfect, but they're a way to begin this conversation. First of all, I'm getting ahead of myself. Why do we need norms? You know, I think there's an understanding that the rule of law applies to cyberspace. So if you're in an actual conflict situation, the laws of armed conflict apply. But there's this huge space underneath here where you have conflict and disruptions that don't rise to the level of an armed attack, that quite honestly, there are no rules here. And I think we need to at least put something on the table and start to adhere to them. The first one I would mention is preventing backdoors. You know, it's very interesting when you ask governments around the world if they'll actually make a commitment that they're not going to try to plant backdoors in commercial products. And you think about a mass commercial IT product, think about the food system. You know, if you're going to try to launch an attack against an enemy, you don't poison the nation's milk supply. That is just not how you go about doing that. On the same hand, private sector companies have to make sure that they actually have a powerful capability to protect the integrity of their source code. What are the controls that you have in place and the things that you're able to do if something goes wrong to find out the who, the what, the when, and how you're going to clear it up? The other part is vulnerability coordination. This is a very interesting thing that's playing out quite publicly. I think the US policy at this point still remains a blog post that says we will share vulnerabilities, maybe when we're done with them or after we're going through an equities process. But it's not like on other governments. The Chinese government has also said that they will share vulnerabilities. So it's interesting. But from a private sector perspective and government, we both need a coordination process for responsible disclosure. We shouldn't fall into the trap of creating zero-day events. It's not good for this world of digital transformation. What are the things that we can do together to stop the proliferation of certain types of code? Are there things that governments should be doing to make sure that weaponizable code is not being leaked? And are there markets that should maybe not should exist? You know, as global ICT providers, you really can only do defense. You can't play in any other space. You can't have like, oh, that's the offensive wing of my company. It does not work that way. It is not safe. So those are things industry has to do, things government needs to do. we should not be thinking about mass events when governments think about weapons in this space. And the private sector should also make a commitment that we will patch all countries, all customers, in all circumstances. We can't be a judger in this space. We have to protect the ecosystem. Once you start trying to throttle patches and fixes for certain locations, you start to get into a series of inequities and a series of challenges. And how do we mitigate attacks? You know, if you build a weapon, because governments will, it should be precise and not reusable. Code that can come back up and be reused again, very dangerous. And what are the things that the private sector should be starting to think about today to help mitigate when we see those types of attacks? The last one is certs. You know, this is always the one everyone is happy about. Oh, support certs. We can get global agreement on that. But I think it's important to remember certs are not going to save you. They are a method of coordination. And there are some governments who think that the certs are sort of like their mainline defensive capability. And that's rather disturbing when you think about the challenges that exist today in the ecosystem. Now I want to talk a little bit about defense. So I said earlier, you know, we spend a lot of time talking about cyber offense, and we spend a lot of time talking about cybersecurity. And oftentimes cybersecurity discussions are, you know, what kinds of technology are you using to detect attacks, or what sort of firewalls do you have, or, you know, are you using the scalable technology in the cloud to protect yourself, or big data analytics? And that's all really interesting. That really is security. But what about defense? What are the concepts that we're actually putting into cyber defense at a national level or an international level? I was at a meeting in Geneva a number of months ago where governments from around the world and academia were brought together. And we were having this really kind of robust discussion about what would happen in a certain situation. And a representative said, well, you know, my government would show up with overwhelming force. And I said, well, you know, we're not actually talking about that. We're actually talking about who's going to show up with overwhelming stabilizing capabilities or overwhelming defensive capabilities. And the room got really kind of quiet because I don't really think we have that many. And I think that's just a discussion we really need to begin to focus on. There aren't easy answers here. It's funny, when you think about weapons frameworks, militaries around the world have started to sort of catalog the types of weapons they have and whether or not they would use them like at a regional hostility level or within a particular action, or whether they would use them globally. And so they have that from an offensive, but what do we have for a framework for defensive? And what are the capabilities that we should think about? So the other night I started to think through, well, do we need to actually have principles here? What kind of principles would make sense for defensive capabilities? And I put some of them up here. There's nothing shocking, you know, distributed, flexible, integrated, adaptable. When I first joined Microsoft, the US government shipped us a computer. And this was a computer we were supposed to use in an emergency situation. And it came into our security response room, and it sat there. And at first it kind of sat in the middle of the room. About 6 months later, it got moved to someone's office. And another 6 months later, it got moved to the corner of the office. And finally, someone put a sign on it that said, "Do not touch." We never actually used this machine. And a couple years later, we got a letter from the US government asking us to mail the 486 PC back. And it's an example of something that wasn't flexible, that wasn't integrated, and certainly wasn't adaptive. It was a good idea that, hey, in a crisis where you may have mass network congestion or you may have certain types of events, we might need some sort of thin line capability to coordinate responses. That 486 PC was not it turns out. But we shouldn't stop those discussions there. I think we need to continue to drive forward into sort of novel approaches. I threw some ideas up here that hopefully you'll take back and think about and look at, where do these fit into the types of things that we should start to explore? You know, if you ever had an event where you had mass congestion, are there alternate ways to distribute software and patches that don't go through a fiber network, Could you do it through spectrum? And could you patch critical infrastructure that way? Or through satellites? What are the things that you might need to do for priority access to cloud? You know, it's funny, if you look in the US context and you go back to a lot of our emergency communications or the government emergency telephone system, that is really based on, hello, you know, you're picking up your cell phone and you're having a conversation, really important. But what if you had to actually do a rapid analysis of big data in order to understand some sort of crisis, a chemical a cloud or something along that line? You might actually need a priority access to cloud services. You're not going to necessarily get that off your cell phone. What are the things that might have to happen there? What about data integrity recovery? We have very little capabilities in this space. When you look around the world, whether it's in government research or whether it's in the private sector, this is going to be a huge challenge as we move into a world where everything is digital. Do we have capabilities for rapid prototyping? Could you reach out in the private sector or open source and with government rapidly put together something that might address an emerging threat quickly, fast, something that you could do in less than a month, maybe a week? Wow, you'd have to deal with lots of challenges to be able to pull that off. We have great capabilities, but I don't know that we've got the right framework or thinking about them. What about automated collective defense leveraging artificial intelligence? What are the things that you could start to drive in that space? We're very much at the beginning of artificial intelligence, a little scary, but you know, the bad guys are also looking at artificial intelligence. So the sooner we start to think about it defensively, the better off that we'll be. And then ultimately, what are the sort of extreme scenarios that we should be thinking about? Because it turns out extreme scenarios happen every now and then. And in a world that is highly calibrated and highly distributed and highly based on a cloud and IoT and machine learning, we have to get ahead of these matters. So I think as we start to move forward, I would leave you with sort of two areas that we need to focus on. One is internationally, we need to really think about the things that as a country we need to commit to and a vision for driving the international system when it comes to cybersecurity. And companies also need to think about that too. What are the things that the tech sector needs to commit to and hold ourselves accountable to? And then lastly, what are the things we need to do for defense? What is the set of thinking that needs to go around this, where that dollar of defense is actually going to buy you much more than a dollar of offense? We have to start turning the tide in this space. And I think with that, we really have to think about the types of leadership that we need to grow, both from the technical side, but also from the policy side and from the business side. That's sort of the trifecta that we're going to have to grow and develop. And I'm hopeful that programs like the Jackson School and the Wilson Center can help sort of shape and direct that thinking as we move into the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. What we thought we would do is collect a few questions from the audience, and I guess what I would like to get a sense of. Oh, yeah. And then and we'll collect a few, and then Paul will take an opportunity to respond.
Victoria Feinberg, retired from the Department of Defense. I'm CISSP, so I know a little about cybersecurity, and I really applaud you for emphasizing defense. However, as you understand, and most other people understand, defense is much less incentivized as offense. Both psychologically, when you have a successful offense, you have a rush. When you're a defender, you can defend as much as you wish, but just one breach breaks your morale. Mm-hmm. So I think the policymakers and the Wilson Institute and everybody really shall design methods to incentivize defense, to give people not just money and technology, but also the sense of pride.
Hi, Duncan Wood. I direct the Mexico Institute here at the Wilson Center. I'd be interested in hearing your points of view about cyber literacy, in particular for legislators, policymakers. I mean, the guys who are going to make the laws, and also for the people who carry out the nation's diplomacy. We're working with the Digital Futures Project here at the Wilson Center to launch a series of events in Mexico City, working with the Mexican Congress to try to educate them in the very basics. I mean, we're beginning with the language, and just to get them used to those terms so that we begin to have a bit more informed conversation. So I'd be really interested in hearing your views about that.
And then one more right behind you.
Hi, I'm Eric Fisher with the Congressional Research Service at the Library of Congress. There's been increasing frustration on the Hill about the sort of inability of Congress to react in a proactive way to the rapidly evolving threat environment in cyberspace. So what I'm wondering, you mentioned a number of sort of different potential policy options or the importance of policy. I'm wondering if you have thought about what specifically you think there might be useful from a legislative perspective. There are lots of legislative proposals, but most of them are relatively narrow or, dealing with specific issues.
Maybe I'll add one more, which has to do with touches on all of these comments. But given the dire nature of and the extreme need to ramp up our capacities, it's going to take a multi-pronged approach at all levels. And I wondered if you could speak to that as well a little bit, what that would look like, including educating legislators, educating young generation, educating across sectors, because it's not just the IT sector, but every single sector has IT issues that needs to be addressed.
Yeah, I really think it starts with education. Many of us who are doing cybersecurity today sort of stumbled in it. I know when I first went to work on the Hill, I got a box of things that were about cybersecurity because nobody wanted to deal with them, and I was the new guy, and I got this box. Turns out it was really fascinating. But I'm excited and encouraged by the sort of evolution of new types of thinking. It used to be that cybersecurity was something that people sort of thought was dealt with in computer science, except that there really isn't a security curriculum that covers these issues in computer science. And I don't know why that is so difficult, but there have been a number of efforts by industry and others to try to kind of break through that and drive that. It is emerging. You start to see more and more focus on that. That's good. I'm super encouraged by these sort of hybrid programs of policy, business, and technology and law that are starting to crop up at universities. I think that's really terrific. I don't know how, we need to find a way to give them more momentum and more opportunities. I think as businesses start to realize that they're no longer a traditional business, but actually a software company, they will start to recruit and hire differently. There's a great article that cropped up a few months ago about Goldman Sachs, the fact that they have more software engineers than Facebook, and as many lines as code as some Microsoft products that they've written themselves. So they get it. I think others are starting to make that. I find I do a lot of work around the world with legislators and policymakers, and they really care about the issues. I think when you hold a public office and you look at, wow, I'm responsible for this country, or I look after the infrastructures, they know what the core needs are of the infrastructure. And so you're over the threshold of, hey, you care. Now, how do you help me understand this in a way that I can act? And that was one reason we formed my team at Microsoft, was to find a way to bring engineers and policymakers together to sort of talk about these issues and get past the sort of hyperbole that lives in newspaper headlines and websites and all that, down to, okay, wow, this is really hard. And how do we work on it together? In terms of things that start to make a difference from a legislative perspective, I do think we've made a lot of progress in terms of the information sharing legislation that's been passed in the U.S., a beginning. How do you start to actually operationalize that in a way that takes advantage of things like machine learning and all of these types of things, so that it's not just let's get together, or I'll email you a PDF of some signatures, but really much faster, much more real time, and also to a point that we're not response driven. How do we start to collaborate on strategic threats that are not just the latest incident, but more protracted campaigns that we're experiencing? And that requires a different level of government sharing and analysis that they sometimes like to hide, and industry is sometimes too busy to look at. And so we've got to figure out how to close that gap. And on the defense issue, I think that is I mean, you hit the nail on the head. It is a profound cultural change. How do you get people excited about the capabilities that need to be built in that space? And how do you start to help people realize that because something bad didn't happen didn't mean these people didn't do their job? And that's something in IT land that I think we struggle with. We're much more attuned to the crisis. Everybody wants to be in that. I was at that meeting. I saw that. We did this. We fixed that. But sometimes the very hard work of the people who prevent those things or enable the capabilities to deal with them when they happen sometimes get lost. And that's just a cultural change we've got to try to drive. And part of that is going to come from executive leaders who really start to understand that and create a path for that.
Yes. A couple, we'll collect more. And
Good morning. This is really, I'm so glad I'm here for this today. I'm Elaine Saray. I'm the Associate Rector of WIUU, a private university in Kiev, Ukraine. And I live and work in D.C., so the Washington. Okay. And I'm seeing a major gap between two areas you've talked about. We've talked about the issue of cybersecurity, countrywide, military-wide, how defense is dealt with. We've talked about our leaders, on the other hand, how they. What about our excuse me, and what about our populations, our general population, where the use of cyber is our everyday water, and because it is, it's there is not the sense of just how dynamic this tool is, so that this tool is actually, in many cases, a weapon. And it's and what we've seen it used as a weapon on a whole host of issues that affect everybody's daily lives. So they don't really realize that they sort of have a gun pointed at themselves all the time. Any case, a loaded gun ready to go off, and it does. And so how would you address the heightening the public's awareness about the full dynamics of what they're dealing with versus the trivialization that we're seeing it actually done? Oh, well, it's just a hack, or it's just a this, or it's just a that, when it's really not just anything. It's really dangerous. Thank you.
no. And then Michael.
Hi, I'm Mark Dallas. I'm professor of political science and at the GW Business School. I wonder how much of this is just organizations putting in the money and investing. And your example of banks is a good one, I think. I mean, are they just, they would seem to be the prime private target at least, because money is digital now, and you would think that they would be getting the most attacks, and yet at least in the media, you don't often hear about banks being breached nearly as much as, let's say, a Target or something like that. So maybe Target is just not putting the money in, and the banks are, and so it's about an issue of proper investment, and that there are defenses. It's just about organizations making that a priority. Or would it just be sort of, at a country level, it would just be too expensive, and so we need collective forms of defense, because sure, Goldman Sachs can put that kind of money in, and it hurts their bottom line, but you know, their whole business is based on making sure they can secure things, right? At a collective level, at sort of national, it just would be too expensive. And so really, we have the defenses, it's just about how to come up with the resources to do it, and using the banks as an example.
So just in front of him, there's, and then over in the middle here. Next.
Thank you. Good morning. Robert Zacone, Presidential Innovation Fellow. We saw yesterday the release of a Talent Manual 2.0, and part of that whole discussion yesterday was that there is a huge gray area, as you've pointed out here. Can we get where we need to be as a society without a trustworthy computing and stretching to networking as well platform overall? I won't get into the whole liability of corporations, et cetera, but it seems like, as Ron Ross and others have called for, until we can have a secure cyberspace to be operating in, all of this is almost moot. We're going to be doing this work. So is there something that industry and others can be doing to really pushing us forward to where we need to be as a society overall?
And then one more, and then we'll.
Hi, I'm Michael Wallstrom. I'm a MA student at the Jackson School. When you talked about defensive capabilities and brought out some ideas for that, it seemed to me that in most cases that was adding additional infrastructure. So I'm wondering how this is going to play out in the context of developing countries where governments are struggling to provide the basic infrastructure.
Great questions. I'm going to try to respond to them in sort of a random order here. I'm going to start with the information assurance related question about what are the things that we need to be doing to try to create a more a trustworthy platform or that type of thing. I wish we could get to a world where everything was secure. I don't think we ever will be. My sense is there are tremendous advances that are starting to take place in secure development, where people are starting to leverage machine learning and AI to try to improve code bases in a way that humans can't, because today humans still write code and humans make mistakes. And even though you can write them to international standards, you can do different types of things, you're going to have mistakes. But then you also have the added challenge of the offensive investments that are being made blow private sector threat models up. You start to create a commercial product that you're going to release around the world. You just don't set off to try to build it to withstand a sustained nation-state attack who's going to leverage that. And not to throw the advanced persistent threat flag down, like, oh, this is why it failed. But the reality is, some things were never just machine. I mean, you take an office product or something like that people used around the world. That's an appealing target for many people because it's widely distributed, but not, again, built to be military grade. And those are economic trade-offs. If you want an $800 word processor, great. But I don't think that's where the world is headed. And so we've got to balance that. I am hopeful, though, that in over the next probably 5 to 10 years, you're going to start to see really dramatic improvements in that by leveraging things like that. Michael, to your question about infrastructure, I think when you look at this from emerging economies, you're right. They have both the best and the worst of both worlds. We did some research on my team a couple years ago where we looked at emerging countries who were getting all sorts of new infrastructure, but what they didn't have was the capacity to do this sort of sophisticated risk management. And so while they had this really incredible infrastructure that was being built, it was becoming an attack platform. And so while they're building new infrastructure, how do you start to integrate those capabilities in? So there's a huge opportunity in that space. The part is, how do we do the right sort of transference of skills and understanding to try to deal with that? Then there is the greater sort of population awareness or consumer awareness. That is really hard. I think, as you start to think about emerging economies in particular, where you're bringing new populations online, I think, in the next 10 years, India is going to bring about 700 million new broadband connections to life. And on that will be lots of new phones and lots of new accounts and financial transactions. How do you prepare that population to be sort of smart in terms of how they use those technologies? Or in developed economies where you're living essentially in a ubiquitous computing environment with your smart home and your smart cameras and basically a live network around you all the time, how do you start to understand what, if anything, you can do to protect yourself in that space? There is a lot of work to be done there. I mean, people are innovating, I think, faster than policy can keep up with them, let alone education. And so that's going to be something we really have to do new thinking around. And banks. I was working my way there. There was an interesting thing that I think we could learn a lot from, and that occurred in the UK, something called CBEST, which was a kind of a wake-up call for me when I first learned about it. This is where the central bank, or the Bank of England, came to the 16 or 17 most important banks in the UK and said, okay, we want to see how you withstand a nation-state attack, a terrorist attack, an insider threat, and a natural hazard. And we're not going to tell you when we're going to attack you, but these things will happen, and we want to see how you withstand. And that was really kind of I think when I talked to people who lived through those changes, some banks really made some major internal changes to get ready for that event, testing by their regulator. And once it was over, they were sort of back to business as usual. Others made fundamental changes about that. And I remember one of them talking to me about, well, you know, we had to kind of wall off our Windows NT estate. And I was like, your Windows NT estate. Now, some of you in the room are not old enough to know what NT is, but that was a product Microsoft made a really long time ago. They can't really be, I mean, you shouldn't be using it. It's just, you know, some products don't live on. And here was a major bank that still had a huge use of it, and they just kept putting stuff around it, thinking it was protected. So, you know, part of it is banks waking up and integrating this into their life cycle and really making the changes that align to the threat. And I think you're starting to see that. This has been part of the discussion around people moving to cloud, which, you know, 3 years ago it was, oh my God, terrifying, fearful, risk. And then they're like, wow, you spend $1 billion on security. I don't spend that much on security. Maybe I'll move this part over to the cloud. And so people starting to make these sort of handoffs on where they think they can reduce attack surface. And I think as people go through this digital transition, whether it's in banks or energy or healthcare, you're starting to watch them try to look for opportunities to sort of shrink what they have to manage so that they can be more effective at it.
Okay, I think we'll have a coffee break, and those were great questions and great remarks, and thank you very much.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.